Good morning, everyone. I know that we've got different time zones here, so hopefully everybody has got their coffee in hand. If it's early morning or if it's later afternoon, that you also have your coffee in hand to go through and enjoy a little bit of a discussion around cybersecurity. So here's what we're going to cover off today. A little bit about who we are, who's Fuse Forward, what do we do, and how are we actually supporting our utility customers, and the things that we've learned over the last 20 odd years of working with critical infrastructure providers. We're going to cover off a little bit and describe for you things that you should consider, some of the risks that we see in the areas of access management, environment management, and data security, and then we'll cover it off with the summary. We only have 45 minutes, so there is no way we can actually go through into a deep dive into each one of these topics. So hopefully you'll get a good overview. That's our goal today, is to provide you with an overview of some of the trials and tribulations and things you should consider in trying to lock down your water utility and your water systems. So to give you a little rundown, who is Fuse Forward? We have been working with critical infrastructure providers since about 1998. In that, past customers included gas utilities like Enbridge Consumers Gas, different city environments that are running water utilities like City of Vancouver, City of Portland, City of Torrance, as well as numerous regional water authorities up in Canada and down in the United States. We've actually also worked with and have been focused on other transportation agencies where they are the ones that are actually running all of the infrastructure on top of the water pipes underneath the ground. So there's also things that you have to consider when you're looking at a multimodal system, things like the infiltration of water systems due to oil leak off transportation agencies. So we do understand that. We've been around doing a lot of this and putting in place all of the systems and technology to go through and run these utilities. That includes GIS systems, SCADA applications, asset management systems, mobile field force, and all the other pieces for the municipal sector that they need to run the utility in a model. We have offices in North America. We're based out of Vancouver. That's where I am today, and our team is. We have staff and offices in Johannesburg and Cape Town. We have offices over in the United Kingdom, and we are currently working with customers throughout North America. So a little bit about myself. I've been working with local governments and utility organizations pretty much since about 1988, where I first started working with oil and gas pipelines and doing real-time control systems and predictive analytics to determine the optimal way of managing the flow of oil and the flow of gas through Trans-Canada pipeline systems. So from that, we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot of the pieces about how we go through and are ingesting streaming data sets from all the different sensoring devices that we basically put on these pumps, different ways that we looking at the actual pipes themselves for corrosion, looking at specific areas of modeling and managing the actual flow patterns in all of these systems, and then trying to understand how all the IT systems are plugged in on top of it. From that experience, I've seen a lot of changes from the analog environment to the digital environment. And with that digital application and the changes, we've now moved towards, and I've been tasked many times to actually go through and architect new solutions using new emerging technologies and new sensoring technologies with digital enablement and internet technologies. From this, invented a new system, which is the foundation for a lot of our products, to manage the knowledge of how all these complex systems work and how we can basically go through and configure them instead of doing custom builds for every piece. What I'm going to share with you today is a culmination of about 25 years of actually managing, designing, operating, and managing all of these IT systems to manage critical infrastructure in the water utility market. So let me start a little bit with the risks of the water utilities. So according to Homeland Security, the Russian government is always targeting right now the U.S. critical infrastructure sectors, and this includes the water utilities. It's also the energy grids. It's also the transportation networks. These systems have a very high safety requirement and very low tolerance for infiltration, because if they go into a water system, some of the key things that can be done in a water utility is they can turn and change the actual chemicals that get injected into the water streams. They can go through and push new kind of contaminants into what we would consider to be treated water. One of the key challenges in a lot of this stuff is most of the ways that we go through and do water quality management, we're still using a lab-based approach for that, where there's about a 72-hour window. If there is an actual inflection point inside or a hack point into the system that can change how the water system actually works. So the water utilities themselves are high-profile targets. Coupling this with the fact that there is a large aging infrastructure and that a lot of the new systems being deployed on top of it for managing it are all digital devices, and we're now increasingly seeing the convergence of our real-time SCADA systems and the internet-connected devices coupling and converting from an analog infrastructure to where we're now using our traditional or our business networks also to go through and link everything together using an IP network. The other challenge that the water utilities run into is they don't necessarily have a lot of budget available in order to go through and build and manage all the security attack points that can come along. And I'm going to share with you as we go through this presentation a number of the attack vectors that you have to consider when you've got nation states and other types of organizations and hackers trying to come into your environment, and the things that you need to do to mitigate those risks. Okay? So let me give you a couple of key examples here. Some of the hacks on the water utilities often go unreported because we don't want the people to get scared. That's part of it. The other one is we don't want to basically be explaining to foreign governments or other actors and bad actors out there that there is a potential threat point that they can go through and take advantage of. But there is some that you should be aware of. Kamiri Water Company. It is a fictional, it's a real example, but it's a fictional name. So it's not the real name. But what happened is, and there was an old piece of technology sitting on the network. It was an application web server for the payment gateway, and they decided to go through and try and allow customers to go through and pay through the front end and on the internet. Challenge that they ran into here, and the hack point was, with that server sitting on the internet, once you got into it, it was with old technology, 20, 30 years old in some cases, and a hacker was able to get in because it did not have all the patches in place. And with that application payment system was on the internal network, but they were able to still go through, and that same network was where all of the SCADA systems were linked into as well. So a couple of things that resulted from that. The hacker was able to get in, alter water flow, change the chemical composition and chemical settings, and they were able to go through and steal customer and payment information. Luckily, and this is only luck, there wasn't a lot of details, and the hackers were not that sophisticated to know what they were looking for. That's not always the case. More and more, we're seeing that that is definitely not the case, where these are targeted attacks and that information is being done for nasty purposes and for primary cyber attacks. Okay? Take another example, Bowman Dam in New York State. A SCADA system was connected to the internet through a cellular modem. And unfortunately, that this hacker was able to, luckily again, just luck, the dam itself and the control systems were not connected, or they were in maintenance mode. And so they weren't able to go through and actually adjust the dam flows. But there is total capability that once they got into the control systems, they could go in, open up the floodgates, and basically flood all the local homes and all the businesses. Now, all of that gives you a couple of examples of the downstream risks of what happens if a hacker gets into your environment. Okay, so one, you've got areas where they can go and take customer and payment information and customer data. All privacy regulations are trying to protect that. Two, you basically have the ability for a hacker to go through and turn on or control your real-time systems. So those are things that we have to consider and things that we need to try and address. So what we're going to do for the next 30 minutes or so is let's go through and look at the 3 areas that you need to do and what you can do in order to go and look at the attack vectors inside your environment and the mitigating strategies and mitigating technologies you can put in place in order to address these 3 attack vectors. So the 3 that we're going to cover off is access management. How do we let devices and people into the environment and monitor and manage what's going on? Number two, the environment. What about all the networks? What about the connectivity of the networks to other networks? What about monitoring what's going on inside the environment once they're in? And then the third, what about our data security? Where is it located? What are the different ways that we can protect it? Because it is the crown jewels. We want to protect those. Okay? So let's start with the first. Access management. What is it? So one of the things that I always look at right now is the biggest threat for an organization today is to actually go through and have somebody inside your environment that's already got the ability to go through and access your systems and services. So for example, let's take Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden, he wasn't a hacker that had to go and hack through a firewall. He was a super privileged user that was a contractor that came into the environment and was given not just administrative rights, but administrative rights to administer systems and assign new users to those systems. That is what we consider to be God rights, something that should never be provided to somebody. So in access management, the key thing that we're trying to do is identify, track, and control who those authorized users are, whether they're a privileged user, whether they're an end user, okay, or whether they're a management user. Okay, so part of what we're doing here is how do we go through and manage the cybersecurity? What we're trying to do is manage the risk of all these people coming in and all the systems that are going in. Okay, so let's take an example. I've talked about Edward Snowden. Let's now look at Target. So everybody might have heard about the Target, where it was hundreds of millions, 110 million Target customers' personal data and credentials were breached. How did the hacker get in? Through an HVAC system connected to their corporate network. So a contractor basically had a phishing attack, and they gave away their credentials, their username and password to somebody that they should not have, and that person was able to just log right into the system and get in there and go through and basically able to, once they were in through the HVAC, they were able to navigate their way all the way through the network into all these different environments and get access to all of that private data. Okay, that is the risk. So access management is key. Who's there? What systems are we letting in? And why are we letting them in? So let's think about a couple of considerations that we should take with respect to user types and what we should do in order to protect our access. So I've got three here. Now these are just end users. I haven't even addressed, and we can talk about system access as well. But the first one on the left is privileged users. Who are these? These are people that are capable of changing firewall policies. Okay, so you've got to be very confident that these people that are coming in are controlled, they know what they're doing. So an IT administrator is a key inflection point. They're a privileged user. Now the key question when we look at IT administrators, have they done their security background checks? We're going to give them rights to set up users. Are we locking them down? Do we know when they've gone in? Do we know what they've done? Are we doing a logging mechanism to go through and track when a privileged user is in? Do they have rights in all the time? They should not be going through, as an example, and accessing a secure system from a remote site. It should all be controlled within that environment. So part of that is they have the capability to set up users. They have the capability to change access policies. So part of this is, how do we mitigate this? Use time-based access from a secure site. Use virtual desktops inside a secure environment. Don't let them use their own PCs. Use multi-factor authentication. Segregate responsibilities between different types of privileged users. Never have a God right given to anybody. So it should be an administrator can go and administer the system, but they shouldn't be able to see the data. A database administrator can be able to go through and see the data, but they should never be able to add users. So it comes down to a segregation of roles and responsibilities. All right, let's go to the far right for a minute. What about mobile and field users, okay, and remote users? Users are in the wild here. So in these cases, people are using cell phones, they're using tablets, they're using other types of public internet devices. Well, that's not how we used to do it. Whenever we were using mobile field systems in the utility sector over the last 25 years that I've been working in it, we've always had our private broadcast network where we weren't using cellular, we weren't using the public internet, but we still had mobile field force. We locked them down. You can still do the same thing with these. So even if we're doing and using different device infrastructure, should that device use a open cellular network? No. We should be using a private cellular network. How do? We go to our telco provider and we ask them for an APN, our own private APN. That at least allows us to go and look and monitor where different cell traffic is coming across, and basically monitoring our cellular users so that they're not in the wild as much as, say, a public cellular user. Okay, what about the other ones? Well, even if that user is coming in, we still want to use VPN access. So a virtual private network. Ensure that every external user is using multi-factor authentication. There's even new techniques emerging right now for field users, which is behavioral analytics, using behavioral ways that users are typically using it and look for patterns and monitoring their usage so that we can basically, if they're doing something that's out of the ordinary, it automatically locks their account. So there is many new techniques arising to go through and manage behavioral analytics and the ways that we're monitoring how different users are using applications. And then the one in the middle is our traditional approach. So this is the one where we're already using physical security. It's already in an environment we control. It's on trusted devices. The biggest risk here is social engineering. Having somebody calling up, having a link in an email where they click it, and then they're infecting a device inside our environment, which is then able to go through and now be inside and infiltrate all the systems inside. So in those cases, there's a lot of education that needs to go on to basically stop people from responding to phishing expeditions. Okay. So let me share with you a little bit. When you now go through and look at trying to go and address these issues, what are the different technologies you need to look at? What are some of the things you want to consider? So first, how do I manage entitlements? How do I manage that a user can access my SCADA system, they can access my work order management system, they can access my GIS. Those are different applications. They should all be managed with entitlements. We should be using single sign-on, but as we're using single sign-on with one username and password and a multi-factor authentication protocol, how do we also go through and make sure that we're knowing what they're using and when they've logged in and timing them out in appropriate time windows so they're not leaving their computers open all the time, no matter where they are. Whether it's a handheld device in the field, whether it's an operations desktop in the operations center, it should time out in a certain period of time. The other thing to look at is looking at the directory services, federation, and segregation. Okay. So part of those things right now is how do we go through and store the different users in different directories? So a privileged user is in one directory, end users are in other directories, external users and contractors in our third directory. And we can have different policies and procedures related to each one and ensure that we're complying with provisioning, deprovisioning, and looking at what they're doing and looking and analyzing it, all the access logs, and be able to look at that, including device authentication. So what devices are they using? And every device has on what we call a MAC ID. And use the MAC IDs to go through, say, only devices where we've actually physically stated that this MAC ID can communicate, can connect into our network, are able to connect into our network. So next one. So I've just covered off access management. So the second one is now it's kind of going through, and that's trying to control what devices are trying to get into our environment. But what about the environment itself? So when we look at something like our environment management, what are the things that we need to consider? Okay, so the environment is all the networks. It's all of the places that we store IT servers, where we put our databases, where we go through and do all of our different processing on these workloads. And the challenge that we have in the environment in a water utility is that those devices sit in the plant, they sit in a corporate data center, they in some cases sit in a vendor's location. So it's a very diverse environment. So if we look at our metering systems, as an example, we might be using Itron or some third-party metering vendor. And that metering vendor is now going to the field collecting confidential customer information and providing us with meter data back. So they're now part of our environment. What about now when we start looking at our corporate IT? So we have our work order management system. We have our dispatching system. What about using those? What about if we're using a third-party cloud service where we're actually going through and say using an online service for doing some of our planning or some of our condition assessment of our assets? Those again are part of our environment. So the challenge that we run into in trying to manage the environment is it's becoming a very large interconnected environment that includes both on-premise systems, cloud-based systems, as well as vendor-based systems. Now, how do we lock all? How do we control it? Okay, so again, let's go and look at the example of the Bowman Dam. Okay, somebody broke into the SCADA system, connected to the internet through a cellular modem. So how did they do this? Well, if you're now looking at this, this might have been one of the vendors that was responsible for going through and managing and monitoring the actual dam. Or it might have been the operations center, and they were thinking that they put in place a remote service in order to go through and be able to do remote control and monitoring. The challenge on this is that they never put in place a firewall or an authentication access controls. So the key thing I always look at is, do you have the firewalls? Problem is when you buy a firewall and you get it off the shelf, everything is open. Nothing is closed. So the things that we need to look at is, it's great that there's a whole bunch of pieces of technology here, but in order to go through and manage our perimeter security, it's no different than how we go through and think about locking down our physical plant environment where our water treatment system is. Okay, so what we do is we put in security cameras. When we look at a physical plant, we put in security cameras. So in our cases, that's our perimeter. When we go in, we may even go through inside the actual treatment plant. There's always lockout, tag out in order to go and work on different electrical equipment. So if we're going through and doing that, again, those are physical things that we do inside our physical plant in order to lock down, do security and safety. The challenge we have is, how do we apply that same thing to our environment? Okay, so what are the things that we should consider? Well, what about network design? Okay, so if you think about engineering firms that are going in and putting in the SCADA systems, are they network experts? Yes or no, it depends upon which firm you're working with. But their key thing is putting together and building a water treatment plant, and then they overlay on it some of the control systems. Now, the control systems can come from players like GE, like Schneider Electric, like Honeywell. Now, the quick question on that one is, well, that's great. That's a SCADA network, but they still plug in to an IP network. And what we need to look at is, where does all of these network points and connection points exist? So we look at these as what we call subnetworks, subnets. We look at how the interconnections go and what the peering relationships are between these. Things that we have is, administrators in a lot of these environments don't necessarily understand the overall topology of how all the network pieces link together and where you should be setting up different firewalls within all the different subnets within your environment. So one of the things we look at is, how do you go through and manage your network design? Issues, if it's too flat, i.e. you've got one network that everybody, once you're in, you can navigate across everywhere, not a good design. What we'd want to do is start segregating out different pieces. So there's a couple of things that we look at. Number one, segregating out the different workloads. So applications sit on an application subnet, databases sit on a database subnet, firewalls sit on a perimeter subnet, and we now segregate out the different layers within the network. Okay? So the other part we look at is, how do we deal with proxy services? Okay? So what we're doing here is we're leveraging the different traffic routing rules, and how do we go through and move data between the different points. Okay, now let's go and deal with network traffic and flow monitoring. Okay, so lots of streaming data is coming in from all these different network systems today, and part of the challenge is how do we go through and take all of that streaming data coming in and monitor what's going on. So let's give an example. We've got a SCADA system now giving us all of the turn on and turn off and all of the valves movements and everything else that's going on inside the environment. Okay, what we're really doing today is how do we go through and deal with these complex events, and they're becoming, we're getting into billions of data points coming in and streaming in front of us at any point in time. The challenge and the risk is that network operators cannot necessarily interpret all of this data anymore just by manually looking at it. So what we need to be able to do is start using automated systems and start using big data, or at least analytical tools, to go through and monitor that data and give us what we call events. So as an example, a lot of streams come in a network. You've got a bad actor inside the environment, and they're trying to continually link in to a work order management system or a SCADA system, and they keep doing the same request over and over and over again. We can grab that using a network monitoring tool to determine that we potentially have a bad actor in our environment. So we've got to look at network traffic and flow monitoring to allow us to do that. Now, what about the third? The third here is network access and routing. Okay, so what I talked about again is firewalls. When you buy the product out the door, all the ports are left open. So how many ports are there? There's thousands of ports on a firewall. Okay, the challenge is how do you know which ones are doing what? What are the ones that you should leave open? Which ones should you be closing? So as an example, I can rhyme off right now the only three that you really consider in some cases, which is port 53, port 22, and port 443. All right, what should you do? So most people don't even know what those ports do. Okay, so there's a question always about that is a piece of domain knowledge that a network and an application engineer would know. In fact, the network engineer might know that those are ports and what they're used for according to a list, but the application developer and the application administrator knows what they're doing with them, what data is transiting across those actual ports. Okay, so if we don't know what all those ports are, we're creating security holes. Those are the holes on which the hackers come in. So what we want to do is close them all down. We also want to go through and look at access routing. We want to start using IP whitelisting. What does that mean? It means that if I've got a third-party contractor out there that is going to do some monitoring of my system for me, that I actually don't want them coming in with their personal laptops, that they've got to give me an IP address at their ops center itself and basically close down and not let everything open and only allow traffic from that one location to link into my site. Oh, and by the way, it should all be done with a private network connection. It should be using a private fiber connection as opposed to a public internet connection. Oh, yes. And by the way, we should also go through and let them in, but we should only let them into our edge, and we should forward all of their traffic through what we call security proxies. So these are a set of services that basically translate what the traffic is coming in from one site, and we reroute it inside our environment at the application layer so that a hacker can't jump beyond the proxy. They might be able to hack in then. If they do hack in from a contractor's site, they get stopped by the security proxy, they get stopped by the firewalls. And we start creating layers of security to go through and stop the traffic in the network access points. So let me give you a summary and look at some of the things I've just kind of talked through. So in all of this stuff, I've talked about the network itself, multi-zone networks, subset segregation within a network design, and the use of security proxy services. And of course, when we start looking at that, those are different design points, different tooling that we can use in order to make sure that we've segregated out the different workloads and that our real-time control systems are on one network, but our business applications are another, and they only have one-way traffic flows. One-way traffic flows are things that we can do with traffic routing rules. The other part that comes in is firewalls. Firewalls are static. They are stateless in the sense of they will stop certain traffic from coming in, open up ports, close ports. It's open or closed. But the other part we want to do is start doing things like intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. That's basically looking at the actual traffic that's coming through a port to determine if there's any sort of content in the payloads of the data that is malicious. And we want to go through and lock down and basically isolate any sort of malicious content. So we want to use our perimeter firewalls. In them, we want to turn on intrusion detection and prevention. We want to also configure them to use IP whitelisting. Now, even better is to actually use only private networks. Use site-to-site virtual private networks. Make sure that everything out in the field is all using client virtual private networks, and that when we are letting and working with third-party contractors, we're using a private network connection and we're not using the public internet. My strongest advice on everybody is, if you're running a critical system, don't use the internet. Don't connect your systems to the internet. What you should be doing is, if you are going to go and use and have this multi-dimensional environment and where you have contractors and third-party cloud services and your own internal systems, they should all be done in a private network design and using private, what we call MPLS or multi-layered systems, multi-layered networks. And that is the way to lock it all down. So let's go and deal with the last. I've got about 10 minutes here. So what I'm going to do here, hopefully I'm giving a lot of good information. We look at data security. So what is data security? Data security is the way to maintain the integrity of the data and making sure that any unauthorized parties, and that could be even our own staff, are not accessing it unless they have the rights, authority, and to actually access that data. So data in this day and age is also subject to certain privacy rules. In different sectors, we have to go through and lock down our consumer information, the personally identifiable information, and how that we're managing the identity of the people and the content that we're capturing. So in the water utility example, one of the most complicated things, there's two key things I always look at. Number one is what does the system topology look like, and what are the points that you can actually go and control in that. So those are drawings. Those are not just drawings, they're also the actual control systems that we get into and the data associated with how the system works. The other main data point that you need to be very locked down on is, what about all of the information that's personally identifiable information around our consumers? So these are our customers have their username, password, or their name, their address. In some cases, all of the different details of their credit card information is all still within the purview of personal identifiable information that has to be locked down and secure. So how do we deal with it? What are the things that we need to consider? Okay, so let me first give you an example of one of the risks. Booz Allen Hamilton, defense contractor. They're also the one that employed Snowden. Okay, and what they did this time is they went in. They were working on a different contract, and this time they put 60,000 files with employee security credentials and unencrypted passwords of government contractors with top secret security clearance on a publicly accessible server. This is but one example. Well, there's a whole bunch of different examples that you can look at that you've seen where somebody else has exposed and dropped in all of these unencrypted passwords to different accesses and to different systems. Now, first off, why is it unencrypted? So when we deal with things like passwords, my key question is it hashed? And is it encrypted? Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different areas on which we classify it. So what I want to talk about here a little bit is 5 things you can do that you should be looking at related to data security. Okay, we all think that the way to go and deal with data security is to encrypt all the data. Well, challenge that we have in a lot of cases is you can't necessarily, at some point in time, you need to decrypt the data. And once you decrypt the data, you've got ability to go through and access it, because you can go through and say, I'm storing my data at rest encrypted, but when I go through and process it to actually go through and allow a user to authenticate and get into the system, you've got to decrypt it. So there's always a point in a computer system where you're decrypting the data sets. Okay, so the question is what level of encryption then, and where do we encrypt the data? To what level of encryption? So you got to do, first step number 1, classify your data sets. So we use a 10-layer classification model. Everything from publicly accessible data all the way through to privileged users' credentials. So you may say, well, top secret data, one of the, I think it's number 8 is top secret. Okay, our business confidential is about 5. Now the key things in these classifications is, well, why is top secret not 10? Because a privileged user who sets up users, i.e. the one that sets up additional privileged users, is the most secure. So they're the one that has the rights to go and give somebody rights to have access to security data, top secret data. So you've got to lock them down in the tightest manner. So part of that is do you have a classification model for your data sets? Have you looked at all your different systems and classified what data is being processed in the system, and hence what level of encryption should be applied to those different data places? Step number 2, how do we go through and deal with data storage locations? So we always treat this like layers of an onion. What's at the core? So what is the area that we store the most secure data in a data center, with biometrics to get into it, with multi-factor authentication, even with the biometrics to get into the data center. So you've already got lockdown secure location, and you have privileged user lockdown. You have to pass credentials to get in, both physical and virtual, to get into those data storage locations. All right, now we've got the data storage location, but that's not realistic if we're also running a SCADA system in a water treatment plant. So we're always going to be storing data on edge devices in the water treatment plant. So the key question is, where's it stored in the water treatment plant? Do you have control systems out there behind a cage, or are they in the field, and how are they connected in? So do we have any sort of points? Like if I look at a water distribution network, we have pump stations. Pump stations are not necessarily monitored. They might be monitored for a certain level of security, but do they have it? And are they storing data within the pump station itself? So when you have a pump system going through, and we're now having digital controls and devices out there, we're always doing a certain amount of caching of data at those locations. So we need to look at how do we go through and plan for those locations, and again, what we want to encrypt at those edge points within the network. Number 3, segregate our data storage network itself. So I've already talked about the different locations, but even once you've got that, we now have a network topology model that overlays. And on that network topology model, what we're trying to do is determine where is the right place that we should go through and store different data sets on different subnets within the overall network design. So that comes into where your IT network designer comes in and says, here, let's create these different points. So as an example, we only store privileged user identity in a very secure location in a subnet that is 3 to 5 layers removed from any sort of public access. That makes sure that if a bad player gets in, it's not on the edge on the internet like the Booz Allen example. It's actually locked down, way down into the environment, and you don't even get access to it. Now, what about the 4th? Okay, so now we've got the data storage locations all in place. We've planned where they go. We've segregated the data stores. We've got encryption technology. We've classified our data. Great. Now what's next? Now we need to log and monitor all the access points. So even though we've got it all locked down, we still need to go through, going back to number 1 is access control. But even though we've got access control, who is accessing our data? Where are they accessing it from? And are we going through an ongoing undertaking to monitor and audit what's going on inside those environments? So new regulations in the European Union are saying that if you have a breach in your environment with personally identifiable information, you have to report it within 72 hours. So there we go. That's part of the logging. Now you've got a regulatory compliance requirement that has to be met in order to go through and find all of those inflection points and be able to go and report it to the regulators. So what are some of the systems and technologies that help you go through and do all of this? So part of the encryption infrastructure is encryption keys, certificates. Where do you get them? Are they coming from trusted authorities, or are you using your own certificate management and doing what we call self-signed certificates? All right, are you using when you're doing all your backups and to all these different sites, are those backups at the same level of encryption? Or are you controlling the encryption keys? And even if you are putting it to a vendor's location, you control the encryption keys that the vendor is using. Okay. What about data residency? So in certain jurisdictions, data can't leave one country or one province or one state. They have to remain in that area because of the actual regulations in the state or in the province. So how do we go through and deal with that? So in those cases, we basically look at, you have certain data sets, or if you are moving them to different points, they all are not readily readable. Okay, and that comes into the encryption again. So then the next one is salted and hashed credentials. So this is where I started off the discussion and said, what is salted and hashed? Salted means you scramble everything. You basically put other characters in it so that it is never pure text. And that is the hash, and we're basically using a hashing algorithm so that we can basically mix all those different pieces with different salted areas so that you're not ever having password as your password. It's never stored that way. And we're always having password policies that are complicated, okay? Use data classification models, and then since we are using what we call a hardware security module, how do we go through and then decrypt data in stream when we need to, when an application needs it? That's where HSMs or hardware security modules come into play. And then, of course, what are the encryption algorithms we're using? We now know that the NSA actually has some holes and have already broken some of the highest encryption. So are you using 2000-bit encryption or are you using 128-bit encryption? So what is the right algorithm that you need to apply to your different environments and your different data sets? So just looking at it, thought I would go through and give a little bit of a summary then. I've kind of covered a lot of content in the span of about a 35-minute presentation here. So here's what I'd like to go through and share with you. So let's go and summarize again what I've told you and what hopefully you've learned. Number one, access management. If you're going to go through and basically put together an integrated security framework, you need to think about your different types of users and devices that are accessing your environment, how you're going to lock them down, how you're going to authenticate them, and how you're going to give them authorization to access certain systems, certain data sets, and certain environments. And how we're going to monitor and track all of that. Number two, what about the environment itself? The environment is not just the network within our treatment plant. It's not just the network that manages and connects all of our distribution assets. It's an environment that also includes the extended network where our contractors are plugging into our environment. It includes networks where our corporate networks are plugging into our environment. It includes the actual systems and SCADA networks and all of that. So from an environment perspective, how do we manage the networks and all the interconnections between the networks? How do we create firewalls between all of these different subnets? And how do we go through and, again, monitor and track and see what's going on for all the traffic flows between all these environments? And then, of course, at the heart of the onion is the data security management. How do we make sure that now we have our state-based data, we're locking it down, it's in a secure location, it's encrypted, and that we know where we're decrypting it for processing, and that we know exactly how we're going through and managing that decryption process and that we're using the right encryption algorithms. So here's the challenge, and it's always a challenge now. Studies have shown that in order to do everything we've just described to go and lock down your water utility, you need upwards of 70 different security vendors to go and do all of this. So it's not as simple as saying, hey, I'm going to go and buy a McAfee firewall. I'm just going to go and get a multi-factor authentication device on my, and go and get Google Authenticator on my phone, and I'm good to go. That's not enough. Okay, it requires a holistic approach to looking at all of the areas and attack vectors and being able to go and put in all of the pieces that are mitigated technologies around it, but not just the technologies. It also requires a set of processes on top of it and a set of management and continuous monitoring to go and make sure that everything is working. Because let's understand, hackers don't stop. They come up with new attack vectors. Every time they see one point of attack and it gets closed down, they try something else. It's like looking at our flows of water in a river. If you put a rock in the middle of a river, they just move around it and find another point. Okay, and so we've always got to be moving everything around, and that's part of the challenge of managing a security environment in a water utility. So here are two approaches. We've just described all the different pieces. Feel free to do it yourself. Okay, custom design it, source and test all the components, go through and look at all the different vendors. And by the way, we know most of them. In fact, we know all of them. Build all the integration points between them all. Build it all and basically make sure you've got your proper budget and projects in place to do that. One key thing with a lot of the engineering firms that are also working on our new construction of our plant environments is making sure that they're building in and provisioning and designing the IT infrastructure and all the control systems and anticipating the linkages between those and the corporate networks, those and the contractor networks, and making sure you're locking down all those environments. Now, just like a lot of the firms do design, build, and walk away, that's similar to what a lot of the IT systems integrators do as an example. Come in, build it, and walk away. Large capital investment. What we've done is we basically put all the pieces together. We do have a pre-built and tested system. That's where we filed all of our patents to go through and design, build, and operate all of these systems for critical infrastructure providers. Now, I just want to give you 3 steps that you can go through. I always like to go and make sure that you've learned something from this experience and from whatever we're presenting. Thing that you can look at is inventory your current security systems. Presentation here will be available. It gives you kind of a checklist, or at least a good checklist of a couple of items that you should be considering in all the different areas, and what are you currently using today to address some of these technology requirements and system requirements. Once you've done that, look at the determine your security technology gaps. And by the way, I don't necessarily think it's just technology, but the other one is who's running the technology, and do they actually have a monitoring and a security operations center on top of it? And then once you've done that and you've seen the gaps, go and try filling them in. Look for a pilot site. Okay, take one of your pump stations, take a treatment plant, and do a pilot to lock it all down, and then let somebody come in and try and penetration test it. Okay, so let them try and do everything they can to attack that environment. That's part of a pilot project using an integrated security solution. So take these 3 steps, go through it, and then you're going to understand whether you're ready to go and address the new attack vectors in cybersecurity that we're continuing to see against water utilities. Thank you for your time and attention, and happy to open up the floor for any sort of questions right now.